Hello listeners and welcome to this week's episode of the Cult Vault. Happy New Year to you all. I wish you all the happiness and health as we navigate 2022. And we are starting off the podcast strong with a special interview with author Zack Bonnie. Before we jump in, I want to remind you all of the upcoming event CrimeCon happening in London in June this year. You can get 10% off tickets today by using the word cult at the checkout. Come along and let's catch up. Come and meet your favourite podcasters, learn forensic skills, sit down to panel talks by private investigators and get involved in the true crime community. Also, I have just launched the first annual Ally Awards. We often celebrate loved ones on this show who have helped us through difficult times, and you can now thank them and recognise their efforts by nominating them for the Ally Awards. To enter, simply tell me a short story of this person helping you via my website, cultvaultpodcast.com. I will also add the link to the episode description. Entry closes at the end of March and the winner will be awarded with a personalised glass trophy. Now, this month's monthly memoir giveaway features both books written by Zack Bonnie, a deeply personal and insightful look at his experiences at CEDU and Rocky Mountain Academy, two notable names within the troubled teen industry. For a chance to win a copy of Zack's books, simply follow, like and comment on my social media posts over January. But for now, here is activist Zack Bonnie. So hi, Zack, and thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I am really looking forward to chatting with you today because I have read your work. It was one of the first books I read when I first started the podcast, and I am excited to learn more about your personal processes. So would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to be on here. I've heard a few episodes and I think even a few colleagues in common you've spoken with. My name is Zack Bonnie. I'm the writer of two books about CEDU and Rocky Mountain Academy. And I've been kind of knee deep in the advocacy work ever since the books started to drop. And it's been a really long process. And it really kind of changed my whole trajectory in life, actually. The writing was one force. And then the decision to publish and all of the decisions that came afterwards has been life-altering. It's really been a whole change to my life. So yeah, we can talk a little bit about that.
I am really excited to learn about exactly how the writing and the publishing has changed the way you thought your life would go and play out. So, and I guess it's important to mention as well that your writing and your work around advocacy will be the main focus of our episode today, because you've spent so long writing these books that we didn't want to spend 2 or 3 hours kind of reliving all of those experiences again, because of course people can go and pick up your book and read it to find out all of those details, which I do highly recommend. And I'm sure we will talk about some parts of the book, but I think that today we've decided that we're going to focus mostly on the writing and the processes, and then your work around advocacy. And that is really exciting for me. So can you just tell the listeners what years you attended CEDU?
Sure. So I went to the Rocky Mountain Academy campus, which is in northern Idaho, very close to the Canadian border in the Panhandle. I went there in July of 1988. And I graduated the program. I was there for almost exactly 2.5 years, I think 3 days less of 30 months. So oftentimes the programs say that it's an average of 2.5 years. But actually there were some kids that were held back for longer. So that's not true. The average amount is actually longer than they portrayed it to parents. And I think it's just another one of the many things that I was like, gotta poke a hole in that. Mm-hmm. So I was there. And let's see, the Rocky Mountain Academy campus opened, I think, in 1982 or 3. So it was still somewhat new to the area. And then I lived there, and I ran away from there. And there's a whole, the way that I kind of compartmentalized the books and how I came to see that I had compartmentalized the memories was very much a like first 6 weeks until the like shock wears off. And almost everybody who like went there ran away at some point, or, and it almost always happened between like 4 weeks and 12 weeks, because like once the shock of it kind of wears off, then the mounting simultaneous pressures that are put on us as kids that are like, pretty significant. It was almost like predictable that that's when somebody was going to take off from the campus and try to find, hit the escape valve. So, I was sent to a different program as kind of a punishment for running away from Rocky Mountain Academy. And that's in the second half of the first book. And to me, it's really about how the brain processed all of this new information. So for me, when I had to go back to RMA to finish the next 2 years of the program, most of which is covered in the second book, it was I had grown so much in those 2 months. Even though I was still 14, I felt different. Like something about my life had changed. And that was kind of important, because in order to kind of process all of the things that the program wanted us to, I was in lockstep with them at that point, because I had been like broken down.
I think I read I haven't personally read the second book, Overwritten, which you have also published, which we can talk about also a bit later. But I have read a few reviews that have described the book and the feeling that you get from reading the book. And I've read the synopsis that says, like, in the second book, you had decided that you were going to conform immediately to the program in the way that the staff expected you to behave, in the way that they expected you to be. And I at 14, like, I can't even remember how I was at 14, and I don't think I understood much of anything. I think you know everything and understand everything when you're that young, but really thinking back to it now, and in my previous job, I was working with 6 to 18 year olds, and I think about the 12, 13, 14 year olds that I was working with, and they just the same, feel like they have the weight of the world on their shoulders without really realizing what that means, or how much their life will change and how much they will develop personally from the ages of just 14 to 20. So when you mentioned there about being 14 and trying to work through all of these things and learn things and understand the program in the way that the staff wanted you to understand the program, I can't even comprehend how difficult that must be to go through that process on a personal, isolated level as well, I imagine, because you are trying to work through all of this on your own, away from family and friends and things that are familiar.
Yeah, and the real knuckleball is trying to unlearn those things later on in life. That's the real screwball here, is that all of this, like, we spent years dwelling on our feelings, like dwelling on them in a negative manner, like where you were just like obsessed with yourself and how you felt, and does this person like me and why not? And instead of it just being like an internal dialogue, we did this outward to group, in group therapies, sessions called RAPs. And so, later on in life, when you're 17 and 18 and you're around people who hadn't been in that experience, it's really hard to reintegrate back into society afterwards, actually. So all these things that I was learning and that all of the other peers that I had there were learning turned out to not be really a very marketable and useful skill in the real world. And in fact, quite to the detriment, you would like open yourself up to be vulnerable, expecting other people to do so. And that's not, as we know, the way the world actually works. So, you know, and the truth is, in just talking about it, you know, we're not really ratcheting down on why that's such a big deal. And I think one of the things that I was trying to do with the books, although I didn't really have, again, the boiled down version that I can say now, which is, you know, taking these simultaneously occurring pressures by the school environment, by being dumped somewhere by your parents, it created a whole new modality for the individual. And so trying to write from the point of view where I can describe all of these simultaneously compounding pressures was something I didn't realize that that's what I was doing until speaking with a researcher named Marcus Chatfield afterwards and reading some of his work. And I thought it was so fascinating because he was in the Scared Straight program at the same time that I was in CEDU, the exact time period.
Wow.
And very, very different programs. And that's another thing that, you know, it becomes really uncomfortable to talk about all of these different programs and how much I've learned since, because, and this is going to sting some of your listeners perhaps, it's hard to quantify abuse. And, you know, and even the wordage that you use in describing the places, like, you know, child psychological maltreatment. That's nice, and it distances the program from us a little bit. It doesn't mention the word abuse. It's child psychological maltreatment, and it's undeniable that we went through that. But certainly there's emotional abuse. There's, you know, there's ritual abuse. There's all of these terms that kind of come in. But the realization that our program wasn't the worst. You know, there was worse places you could be sent. There was, but that's not to detract from some of the real harms that existed in the CEDU model. The longevity was a real big tool. I mean, to be somewhere for 2.5 years as 14 just sounds like forever. And it felt like forever. And it was oftentimes really torturous at first. And then over the course of time, you become institutionalized and you kind of get used to it, and you're kind of granted new freedoms and privileges, and it makes the time go by a little bit faster. So I understand that the manufactured environment that these places create is a really important conversation piece too.
I think the way you've described the mounting severity of the program, sort of after the first 4 to 6 weeks, when you mentioned the shock wearing off, and then the eventual institutionalization that happens with each, well, I don't want to speak for everybody, but with some of the residents of these, or I think residents is the word that CEDU.
You could say detainees.
Detainees, you know? Yeah. I did have somebody email me a very long time ago and tell me that some of the wording that I used was incorrect when talking about people that had attended CEDU. So I just want to make sure that I'm not upsetting anyone, but I think residents was the word that was recommended to me. So residents.
Well, I'm sure you are, and there's no way around it. You know, I one of the things I kind of wanted to make a disclaimer too, which is, you know, there's going to be a percentage of people who don't agree with me, you know, and that think the program was really good, and they don't want to look at the Stockholm Syndrome or their psychological, you know, how they dealt with the program as part of the force that made them believe that. You know, there's going to be some. And another thing is that when I was writing the books, there wasn't the Paris Hilton out there. You know, it was kind of a vacuum, and I didn't know how many people were going to poo-poo what I had to say, or tell me to shut up, or that I was exaggerating or lying. And So I do feel like I helped, there was a door that was slightly ajar with many people who were advocates who'd come before and a few lawsuits. And I think I helped push the door open a little bit more. And then some of the real work in the last few years by Paris Hilton and Breaking Code of Silence movement really just smashed that door wide open now. So I do feel some responsibility and pride for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's like you said there about seeing the opportunity to be at the forefront of change and taking that opportunity and using it. And it kind of reminds me of the Me Too movement, where one or two people came forward, which I imagine must have been so incredibly scary, and it makes me also think of things like Nexium, when the first 2 or 3 people start to come forward, and to be those people, it must be scary. You're putting your work out there, you've put your memoir out there, you're making yourself extremely vulnerable to be one of the first people to say, like, actually, do you know what, this program didn't work for me, and it's kind of had a really negative impact on my life since. And to be one of those people that then makes the snowball effect happen. We saw the Me Too movement has just made waves through the entertainment industry. And now, I was just talking to my partner last night about how at a concert one time, Justin Timberlake pulled down Janet Jackson's top and her breast came out, and then she got cancelled for the rest of the tour. And Justin Timberlake continued on the tour kind of as the headline and act. And I just thought, after the changes that have been made around sort of equality and the Me Too movement, I don't think that I'd like to think that wouldn't be able to happen these days, and she would not have been persecuted in the way that she was. And I know that's not comparable to what we're talking about. It just kind of it all seems to fit in. And you've got these people at the forefront, such as yourself, at the forefront of change, and then as the momentum picks up, there are notable figures like Paris Hilton, with the following and the influence that she has, that can then kind of, once these brave people have opened the door, these people with money and influence and other resources can kind of bring the house down. So now hopefully everybody keeps talking and we keep building this momentum and keep seeing this change everywhere. But just to go back quickly to something that we spoke about briefly before, I think you can definitely, when we read your work, it matches exactly what you've said so far. So in the first 4 to 6 weeks, we kind of feel that initial like, oh, what's going on? I'm not really too sure what's happening. And then after the kind of 4 to 6 week period, we see you realizing that this is where you're going to be on average for 2.5 years, which doesn't make sense, because I don't know if you knew of anybody that left way before 2.5 years. How would they make 2.5 years an average if they didn't have people leaving 2 or 3 or 4 months into the program?
Well, unlike a lot of the places that are out there, there was a beginning and an end.
Okay.
So there was when we graduated, it was because we had gone through these milestone experiences, and you had to go through all of them in order to graduate the program. So there was no way to do it in a shorter amount of time. And really what's, I guess we'll kind of get to the end part of what we might talk about today real fast, because, in the final analysis, Casey, I really, in writing about it, I really only wanted to write about the last several months of the program, but in order to really tell that story, and I've yet to do it, I haven't done that yet. And you've probably heard some of the things that are out there. Like, we had this lifeboat experience where we had to tell everybody whether they lived or died and why. And then we had like rituals where we were buried, I guess, for lack of a better, died. And then, we had a chance to say everything that we regretted in life and how we would have done it differently. And mind you, I'm only 16 at this point. So it's a real powerful experience that you go through for 2 and a half years that creates the level of, quote, safety. So you'll do these exercises that come in the last several months. So like, and you were a huge believer in the program by then. So you believed in all the dogma and all of the doctrine. And so in order to create and tell the story accurately, I needed to do the whole buildup from day one in slow motion, and it goes faster and faster and faster and faster until the end, at which point, which I haven't written it yet, hopefully the reader will, unlike having all of their questions answered to some degree in the first book, having so many more questions about what happens to a kid after he goes through an experience like this. And writing is hard. So after writing the second book and publishing it, I didn't do any PR for it, and I hardly made any social media posts. And in fact, I've been like borderline allergic to staring at a computer screen because I spent so long just waking up in the morning. You were going to ask me about the process, knocking back some coffee. And, you know, I would be writing 2 hours before the sun came up. And then I would sit there until hours after the sun went down. And it was the most grueling, horrible, but rewarding experience I almost ever had. And also, you know, growing up with ADD and having some impulse control issues, my whole life I was told that was something I wasn't going to be able to do. I don't have the organizational capability to write out chapter by chapter and organize your thoughts so another person can get into it and read it interestingly. You know, these were all things that were not in my skill set. And so it was all the much more rewarding when it came close enough to start deciding how can I publish this. And another thing is I might not have ever taken the time to do so if I hadn't suffered a traumatic brain injury and I was struck by a car. I wouldn't have had the time and money to actually do the writing process. So for all you people out there who have an artist in your life, you know, it's not bullshit. They need support. They need you to show up when it's time to show up, and maybe even give them a couple of bucks or whatever. It's just can't be understated how important art is and how shafted artists get.
Just little things like little pick-me-ups help when you're kind of losing momentum or losing inspiration or find yourself procrastinating a lot, and somebody comes along and says, like, you know, oh, can I read a small section? And they're like, I really liked what you've done with this part. And you're like, do you know what? I just needed a little bit of positive reinforcement, and now I'll get back onto it and carry on.
Yeah.
But even editing one of these episodes is quite tiring because I didn't have any audio editing experience before starting the podcast. I mean, this will be episode 140, and I would still argue that I don't really have any podcast editing experience. But just one episode takes it out of me. So to write a whole book, then to go through it up teen number of times to you know edit the passages to add things in. I imagine you lay in bed at night probably to this day thinking of things that may have been interesting to include in the first and second books respectively.
Yes. You know, I do want, so here lies the rub, which is it takes a village to do this. It's not a solitary act. The writing is, but everything that comes after that is not. And I must call out my editor, and Carly. She, first of all, just really read what I wrote. And that iteration has changed so much because of what she brought to the editing process, and asking me the really difficult questions like, what did you mean when you said this? And let's unpack this thought a little bit, and putting the work back on me to improve it. And her really bringing me to the task of going through, as you said, every single word inside of every sentence, inside of every paragraph, on every page, in every chapter, to make sure that it tells the story, making it easier for the reader. And she brought out the best in me. And so I'm still very appreciative of that, because the books wouldn't have turned out as well without her. And she really heard my vision that I had, like all of the, I've had so many people comment positively with the bits from my parents or the bits from the school.
Yes.
So in between the chapters and sometimes within the chapters, we have these interstitial bits which give the reader more of the story that isn't just from young Zack's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was something I had in mind. And so I had all of this huge bibliography of things that had to do with coercive cults and institutionalized persuasion and former court cases that had been heard. And she really dug in and saw what I wanted to bring. So I can't tell you what it's like to have that kind of collaboration with somebody. So she really extracted the best she could from me. And then just a few months afterwards, it was all of a sudden like, oh, now you've got to knock out a second book. Because I did this fundraising campaign. And so like I had to produce a book that the first one took me about 9 years.
Oh my goodness.
And then the second one took me 2 from beginning to end. And I'm really proud of it, because that's where I guess I really became a writer, and that's why I'm not doing it right now. I took a long break after that.
Well, the next one might only take you 6 months.
Could do. I mean, the editing is still going to be whatever the amount of time is to write it, add twice for the editing. That's what I've learned.
Let's jump back a few steps, just so we can make sure that we cover as much of this as possible. I'm hoping that anybody listening that's had an experience that they feel is worth writing about, and if you think it's worth writing about, I'm going to go ahead and say it definitely is, because, if you've had that thought, maybe somebody might want to read that. The chances are that there is somebody out there, or a few people, or a many few people, who would definitely love to read your work. So I'm hoping that this conversation with Zack today can encourage you to pick up a pen or open your laptop or get a piece of chalk and a rock or however it is you're thinking about doing it and get started. So why did you initially decide to write a book? You mentioned there that you had the accident with the head trauma injury. Were you already thinking about writing by that point?
Yeah, I can't 100% blame that, because I had already begun, but it was really a personal project. I was fortunate enough to already have been kind of brought up in a literary household. My mom is a published writer. My dad writes. So there was already a kind of skill there. So it began as kind of a personal project. And at some point, I guess about 3 years later, and I would just kind of, I'd wake up and write for an hour every couple of months. It wasn't taking up a lot of my time. It was an in-between jobs kind of thing. And then I was struck by a car and had a mild traumatic brain injury. And I became much more interested in telling the whole story. I didn't at that point think I was going to be able to do it. Like, I just didn't think I could do it. But after waking up day after day and day after day and making it my practice, it started to come together. And then in 2014, I got it about as good as I could without other people. And I didn't have friends, I didn't have a lot of friends, and I wasn't in touch with anybody who I'd gone to the program with or anything like that. I was in touch with a couple of advocates, such as Liam Sheff. He had gone to the CEDU California campus, and a few people on Fornits. If you remember that website, Fornits, that before Facebook, there were a few community message boards for people who had been in different programs.
Okay.
And I started putting some of my writing there and receiving some encouragement. And I guess I did know that I knew that there was a couple of other books out there. There was Gone to the Crazies by Alison Weaver about her time at Cascade, I want to say. And there was, I can't remember the author's name now. I think he wrote a book called Such Were the Joys. And he wrote about his divorce and had mentioned that he had either gone to CEDU or RMA. So there were a couple of places where it appeared in literature that I had read. And then I decided that, you know what, in order to really do this right, I need to go into therapy. I'm going to have to go, in order to really do this right, I'm going to have to go into therapy so I can actually retrieve.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really helpful, because being able to kind of give a 14-year-old the voice that he didn't have then to somebody who really wanted to hear what he had to say, even if it was 20 years later, was really beneficial to me. And so I also credit that experience with being helpful. When it came right down to it, the sitting there and writing, where you actually have to sit there and do it. It's not just talking about it like, oh, I could write a book and, oh, I could do this. It's the hardest thing in the world. It's such a hard thing to do. And as you were kind of alluding to earlier, you can't help it. Your thoughts are sometimes going, who's going to read this? How am I going to get them to know about it? So every fifth thought you have is about why you're doing the work. And you have to take that and just lop it off every 20 minutes. You have to just lop off that piece of you that wants to reward the part of you that's doing the work, because there isn't, as far as you know, there really isn't one. And so that was really hard for me, because I think we come from a time of instant gratification, and Facebook was out there, and there was all these distractions, and I was like, no, I have to keep these blinders on, and I have to do this no matter what. And it did feel like torture sometimes. It was the hardest thing. And then doing it again. So to get into the advocacy thing a little bit, after writing the first book, I went out to Los Angeles, where I had the chance to meet Jody Hobbs, who started Survivors of Institutionalized Abuse. And I had the chance to meet Paul Morantz, who was the one who got bit by the rattlesnake. And
it's so strange to hear you saying all these names, because usually when people come on the show and they talk about famous televangelists and things like that, I'm kind of like, oh, well. But all of these people, because of so much of my time has been kind of spent hearing these stories and reading publications and articles and books such as yours, I'm like, I guess I know all of these people.
Yes. Well, so right before the book came out, I went out there and I realized I wasn't really alone in this whole thing. And it really opened up my eyes. And then very soon after, about a year later, the door was opening. And it was in part because my book was making a lot of rounds. That was a whole new part of this, is don't forget, Amazon was in the process of taking out all the independent and regular big publishers one by one. What happened to the publishing industry in 1 year due to Amazon is very similar to what Netflix did to Blockbuster.
Yeah, my dad works for Royal Mail, which is the nationalized delivery service over here. You post your letters, Royal Mail delivers them. We'll work for Royal Mail in their little red post vans and stuff. So also did the same thing to the postage industry when for a little while. It was a bit touch and go there for my dad and his job, but yeah, it's okay now. So I can't understand it from a publisher's perspective or an author's perspective, but from kind of the delivery side of things, I kind of can see it from that side of things.
Yeah, well, it completely upended the publishing world. And as somebody who was like, I don't even really want to be a writer, I just have the story I really want to tell. So I self-published. To answer the question that you're going to ask, is I did kind of found my own little publishing company, not with the program, which I did have huge aspirations for, because many of the earlier advocates after my book came out thought that I was poised to be able to help out many of the other video, documentary, docuseries, book projects that were coming, that were being conceived of. But gosh, I mean, there was, website, you have to build websites and start newsletters and make content. And I mean, these are all things that are the opposite of the writing, skill. And I just came to a point where I couldn't do it. I bit off way more than I could chew. And then meanwhile, after the first book came out and I had done the Indiegogo campaign to raise money and start writing the second book, I had all of the people that were reading the first book wanting to reach out to me and tell me about their experiences. And I got to tell you, over the 4 or 5 years now, I've heard so many disturbing stories. And I don't want to get into the whole salacious side of it, because it's sad. It's people's lives, who were sexually abused or had drug overdoses, or, in some cases, a child went missing from the program and never reappeared. Families sued, there's a whole, after these programs, part of it that the schools never know about, which is, destroyed families in part because of the money that it cost or the control that it took from the youngster at the time. And sometimes even with the parents, there was a weaponization because they were in the process of an ugly divorce. There's just so much meat here. It's very dramatic. So it's been a real experience to hear from kids who were treated in worse situations also, where there was a lot more violence. And, like you said, there's always a way to say something the wrong way and step on somebody's toes. And there was mistakes made when I first started too. There was people I didn't know who they were, and they were asking too much of me, and I blocked them on the internet. And I realize now that I was having a trauma response to some of that. I couldn't handle it, and I didn't have a way to deal with it. And it took me a process of becoming an advocate and having much more conversations with more and more people to finally find my own footing in this. It was really hard at first.
There's so much that comes with advocacy work, and to be one of the first voices to shine to whistleblow on this industry that for so many years has only had a certain amount of light brought and attention brought to it. And I feel like there's only so much that comes from groups that bring the public's attention and the media's attention. So you've got things like Nexium now is been just exposed for exactly what was going on. All those people that came forward and spoke out, all those people that testified in court,
and criminal penalties given out.
Absolutely.
It's a big deal.
And you've got examples of that, and then obviously we can't talk about these programs without referencing Synanon. So when you talk about Synanon, again, it's one of those examples of people would say, oh, those people with the shaved heads, oh, did you read the news article about this, the rattlesnake? And once people start once people start taking part in criminal activities where the law become involved and the media pick up on it, that seems to be when there is change and when there is awareness brought to certain things. So for a little while, from what I can gather around news articles and stuff, there was a lot around rehabilitation and therapy and things like Alcoholics Anonymous that came from Synanon and what that movement was practicing, basically, and what the media managed to find out through people's testimonies once the thing was blown open and people started talking about it. It's almost like this industry is having the same thing happen now, and we're right in the middle of it, but it's just taken so much longer for it to happen. these other groups like Nexium and Synanon, they are like...
Some of it has to do with the parents. It's not like whistleblowing and you point out the whole industry. It's also like, why is it that affluent parents can't raise their fucking kids in this country? And frankly, let's not lead with that.
There's a lot of things that are tied up as well into this. Synanon, Jonestown, the Manson family, especially the Manson family, and the Anthill kids, and Shinrikyo, and these really infamous sects that existed that have been through the justice system because of crimes committed. They all happened almost so fast that things just unraveled before there was a chance to do any damage control. But this industry has been around since the 60s, 70s. I was doing some research into enthusiastic sobriety, and that goes like way, way, way back. It's almost like we're in the middle of the unraveling now, but it's taken so much longer for it to happen.
Well, let's look at it from an anthropological standpoint, actually, because I do think now it does, elements of this do exist in other places, but this is kind of an American phenomenon where you can send off your kid to be more compliant. And there is some history here, of course. The Native American re-education camps and schools were some of the first that we know of that were engaging in a kind of technology of thought reform. And it was also spiritual reform because they were Christianizing these kids also. Now, I'm not a historian. I haven't studied this period, but I know that there's other researchers who have. But it does show you that there's a history here of gaining compliance through isolating the child from his regular unit. And it's powerful. We know that this is powerful because the military engages very conscientiously in the same pattern, which is we're going to become the new parent and the new brotherhood, and there's rewards that you get for this. And this is really interesting because you know what you're going to get, you're going to struggle, you're going to have peak experiences, but you also know you're going to have these friendships for the rest of your life. And that's one of the things that I really resent about the programs is they tried to convince us the same thing, but they didn't. They created lifelong enemies sometimes. A lot of people do have lifelong friends, don't get me wrong, but you could have had that in any other experience. It wasn't, the trauma bonding is a separate thing. It's like a separate thing that has to be talked about and studied. And I also wanted to mention Monica Lewinsky as a whistleblower and how powerful a woman she's turned out to be, where even, when it happened back then with Bill Clinton and everything, I was just like, one of the people telling the jokes and considering her a floozy too. And so it took her 7 or 8 years to pull herself up and then start to write articles, and now seeing what a victim she was. And I just anytime I have the chance to point out how courageous and incredible a person she is, I feel like it's worthwhile to do. So I just wanted to put that in there as far as the Me Too movement. I don't know if you saw this, just a couple of months ago, he acknowledged it sort of publicly.
I thought so myself, and I wondered if there would be any more that came from that, because we know that a lot of these programs have had government endorsements over the years. There's been a lot to do with the Reagans around certain programs and things. And that was going to be another point that I was going to make as well. I wonder if the unraveling of this particular industry has taken so long because it has so many institutions attached to it. You've got big pharma with the encouragement of medicating or over medicating children, as young as 8, 9, 10, and in these programs that medication continues, or the medication is changed, or there's a combination of things that children are put on to try and air quotes manage their behavior or make them more compliant, whichever way you want to look at it, or whatever kind of experience that you've had. But you've also got psychologists and therapists who are recommending these programs, and then you've also got court systems who are putting court orders out for children to attend these programs, and or go to juvenile detention, and then you've got the evangelical movement in America, which is really pushing things like Teen Challenge that come across with the religious aspect and have the Christian teachings attached to the therapeutic side of things, and then there's also the government endorsements, which we mentioned, and the big manipulation of families, not just the manipulation of the residents in the program. So there's so many different tangents and so many different institutions that have benefited off of the back of this abuse of children, that maybe that's another reason why this has taken so long and why it's such an uphill battle for all of these advocates and yourself as well to make this change. And that maybe that's why it's taken so long.
And I can think of 2 or 3 other some legal considerations for you to kind of put in the back burner there, which is, when you are a child, when do you cease to be a child and get to be legally an adult? And, this is in flux a little bit because the parents, even the right to hit your kid with a switch, these are bringing up a lot of really important conversations that I think, even though it seems like they're not the same conversation, it's very much the same conversation. As that researcher, Marcus Chatfield, and I have spoken so much through the years, one of the reasons that we feel like this hasn't gotten the attention that it should is because it's a bit like pointing out that the emperor wears no clothes. It's a bit like, well, if it's okay to send kids, have them kidnapped professionally in the middle of the night, taken away from everything that they've ever known, brought against state lines to a place that they've never been to before, strip them naked and start screaming at them or beating them. Okay. So where do you draw the line between what would be like, you can't bring that up because you start to bring up what is the point of education and what is the point of good parenthood. So it's like, as soon as you start to poke holes in the authority structure, you start to point holes in the entire educational structure. And I think that's one of the reasons that people don't want to go too near this traditionally. And I'm talking about the media here. And you also have very powerful forces when you begin to make the differentiation between these privately paid programs and kids that are wards or burdens of the state, to use their term.
Yeah.
And so the funding and again, if you go back and really kind of look at it from a historical perspective, there were exposés about straight. There were exposés about the Kids of New Jersey and Kids of El Paso programs. There were even about CEDU in California in the 70s. So there does seem to be an effort here to bring it into the light and then let it go away again. And I just hope that we've reached the end of that cycle. Now you must know about what our Oregon senator, I think she is, her name's Gelser. She's passed a whole comprehensive group of statutes, I guess, in Oregon that limit these programs. And they're very concise. She has a very good understanding of the coercive nature of these programs. And I think she's going to be our big hero here. She has a really great understanding of this, and she has the ear of Washington to get it to hopefully pass. Because traditionally when they do these laws, they lose steam as they travel east and especially through the south.
This is another thing that we've mentioned on the show as well. English law is English law. It doesn't change from one city to the next. But with America, states are so different. You know, one state might not be able to have certain programs and boarding schools because of legislation that's in place, but then, you know, 2 miles down the road across state lines, that state has different rules and laws, which means that a program that's been shut down here can reopen there, just under a different name or whatever. And we talked about this quite a bit on the show and how that's also problematic. And hopefully there can be some unity across the reform that seems to be happening as we speak. And with the media attention that you mentioned before, there is more and more coming out now. You mentioned the SIA, who I follow on Instagram, so I see the posts that they are sharing all the time, but it seems to be more indie papers or smaller platforms that will comment on these programs more often than the others. And again, it comes back to those endorsements that certain media outlets, you know, the big giants will have with certain members of government. And again, it comes back to what you mentioned before about, you know, once you start to look at it closely enough, you realize that it's all linked together, and too many big companies and institutions are benefiting from the money that comes from one person attending one of these programs for upwards of 2.5 years, which is I don't know how anybody can exist in that space for that amount of time.
Well, there's other practical considerations too, which are there's not a lot of archive footage. You know, so if a production company that's owned by NBC, because they've screwed up so bad with their Matt Lauers and their Weinsteins, that they actually wanted to tell this story, and I from what I understand, maybe they do. It's also, what would the viewer get? What could we show them other than reenactment? And these are expensive, and also, if we were actually to show just one of these rap sessions for the realness that it would stop the practice overnight.
Mm-hmm. And again, it comes back to that salacious side of things. You don't want to just you don't just want to take the parts that people find most shocking, like with the true crime community. It's like, where do you draw the line on having jokes about Jeffrey Dahmer eating people on the hoodie that you wear out in public, even though those real people with real families and people that loved them, and you've got all this stuff with victims, but it's like people become so desensitized to those subjects that they don't even think about it, past that, oh, this is funny and it's quirky and I'm going to wear this hoodie out. And it's something else that we've spoken about on the show, where we say, it's important to highlight that cult-like methods of control can exist between two people. One person that is using the control methods and one person who is under the influence of those methods. It doesn't have to be, oh my goodness, have you heard about Jonestown? Let me tell you how many people died and how they died. And did you know that there were children involved? Of course, those stories are still important to tell, because we need to make sure we're raising awareness, looking out for red flags, looking out for things that, if we see a pattern emerge within another group, we can try and intervene before tragedy happens. But it's still important to recognize that if a documentary is made about CEDU specifically, or other therapeutic boarded schools or wilderness programs, that you're not just saying, oh, they didn't show all this horrible stuff that I've heard about in people's testimonies, because if that's all people want to see, then it's not doing the job of telling people's stories, personal stories. I'm doing that thing where I can't formulate my thoughts, but I kind of hope that I've got myself across. It's still important to highlight the practices that happened in CEDU and other programs like it, but they shouldn't be the center of what is discussed if people are only looking to get the salacious side of things, because like you've mentioned before, and like Andrew, who I've spoken to, whose episode comes out in a few weeks but will have been released by the time this episode comes out, he is looking for helping people to adapt when they come out of these programs and have to integrate back into typical everyday life, and how there's no support for that, and how that is what he struggled with the most. So that reintegration is something that we focused on in his interview quite heavily. And, you know, maybe if there ever was to be a documentary, some of it can focus on that. Maybe some of it can focus on other options that existed other than these programs that could have been explored before a child was sent to one of these programs. There's many other things that can be focused on other than just the
transgressions.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, it took me ages to get there.
No, I hear you. I think that's what's missing. And I've been speaking with a couple of people about specifically that, because when you look at how it is to reintegrate, because I was like, I totally believed in the program. So I couldn't understand why I was feeling so, I'm going to say it, suicidal. You know, about 6 or 8 months after I got out of the program, I felt like there was nowhere I fit in. And I didn't, you know what I was going to do. And I had done all this changing, but my parents hadn't done any changing. And it was really one of the lowest points in my life, actually. And at the same token, it might well be where I started to reintegrate a former sense of self that had been lost. I don't know. I mean, I haven't really uncovered too much of that in my therapeutic sessions, but there are similarities between people who are in all of these different programs react to things, because there's an umbrella that we were all kind of in the same, we had a stasis, whatever the abusive, neglectful situation was before we went to the program, then whatever the program was usually compounded most of those issues and told you that that was enlightenment, so that when you got out, you were actually just as screwed up, but you thought you weren't. And, you know, I'll give you a few examples. When I got out, I couldn't take a joke. I couldn't fucking tell when a friend was like messing with me, because I had been fucked with in this situation for so long that my brain reacted to criticism the same way that it dealt with everyday joshing, that everyday just banter between kids. Another thing, when I got out, the way that kids interact in the real world, we were told that was a big game. So we were always telling people that they were playing games and that they wanted attention, or that girls were playing attention games, and like just things that like you wouldn't be very popular either. And then you have the whole flip-aroo, which is, after having your adolescence taken from you, you engage in extended adolescence. So you increase your risk, you increase the amount of drug experimentation or sexual experimentation. So a lot of kids get out of there, and now they're young adults. And depending on what that support network was like at home, one slip up could make a guy wind up in jail, or, addicted to something really serious. And so all of the many attritions, kids who've died by suicide or drug overdose or wound up in jail and had really rough lives afterwards, that's another part of this that is unstudied. It's unspoken of. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to, because we had our psyches really scrambled. It wasn't like, nobody was getting out unscathed. Let me put it that way. Even the people who feel positively about the program now would have to admit that nobody got out unscathed.
Do you think that what you've just spoken about there is where the influence for the title of your book came from? Because you've just said, you know, that people from the program end up dead, insane, or in jail, which is the title of your memoir. Book one, anyway.
It's even creepier. We were threatened that that's what happened to us if we ran away. So, like, if you run away, you're going to wind up dead, insane, or in jail. And then at the same token, whether you stay there and graduate or you don't, the chances that something like that might happen to you are still pretty great.
And you mentioned previously that when you started to write this book, you were in touch with Liam Sheff, who is one of the people that has created one of the only CEDU documentaries, I believe, that exists today. Was he working on this documentary at the same time that you were working on your book, or did it already exist at this point?
Yeah, no, it's, first of all, I miss Liam very much. We became pretty good pals, although we didn't meet in real person. That makes me sad. It makes me sad also that I was so freaked out that I thought he was making a program production. So I resisted being part of it. And then we really became kind of fast friends afterwards and started talking a lot. And then I sent him a copy of the books, and he was really very supportive of it. I think there's also, the way that people, like, a lot of my friends joined the military right afterwards. I just spoke with a guy who was at my campus 10 years after I was, and he joined the military right afterwards and just moved on with his life, didn't really think about it. And it's all these years later that he's kind of realizing how, through the trauma of war, this is through the curtain of his mind looking backwards, seeing how unsettled his life was actually. And that, going to war actually made it seem like it was going to straighten things out, and it's really interesting for me to hear some of those perspectives. One of my closest little brothers also joined the Air Force right afterwards.
When you say little brothers, you mean a little brother in the CEDU program?
Yeah.
Not a real brother biologically.
No, my little brother in the program, who was actually like a year and a half older than me. It's always funny to like talk about that, because I had I was really young when I got there. And so a lot of my younger brothers who I had like authority over were actually like a year and a half older than me. Like they had to shave more than I did, and like, but I was the like grown up now, and I was the one telling them that they had to grow up. This is just weird place.
I wonder how difficult you found the writing process when you spoke about how difficult it was to understand when somebody was joking, or to take criticism, and to apply all of those things to writing a book, a memoir, no less, of your life, your personal experiences. It's not a work of fiction where you're making things up and you've created a universe and a landscape and characters with, strange names and purple skin or whatever it is that your fiction work might consist of. You're writing about your life and your experiences, and you're putting yourself in an extremely vulnerable position. And you're going to therapy as well. So you've been through therapy, in air quotes, which is why you're writing the book in the first place. But in order to write the book, you've gone back to therapy, which you said was then a positive experience. So I imagine that all of those things together during the writing process must have been quite confusing to like disentangle.
Yeah, it was actually, but that's what it was like at 14. Because, to be put into a situation where now it's all about you and how you made people feel, and how, you've made life so bad for your parents that they've had to spend all this money to have you taken away. And like, we just like took the onus of everything that was wrong with the world or wrong with school or wrong with us and magnified it into ourselves. So, and then we're told that this is therapeutic. And not only that, but this is like the method for the next 2.5 years. This is what your life is going to look like. And so yes, it was. And yet I feel like it kind of helped the writing, because I didn't second guess it. I really tried to write the books from a 14-year-old's point of view. Like, okay, here's my book report on Rocky Mountain Academy. And by the time you get to the second book, you can sense that this kid is starting to grow up, but he's growing up with these like kind of false ideals in the background. So everything is now gauged against the program. Like the parents are just like, they're gone. They're not even like part of the equation most of the time. And that was true. You know, I like went to these like extreme lengths to be likable to people who I hated. You know, the staff, I was doing everything I could to impress them, like every intellectual trick, every like tear I could shed, anytime I could like get their attention, and like the fawning, you know, it was like living within those circumstances and becoming a person that I was not. And I desperately sought that attention from people that I now wouldn't, you know. And that's been part of it. And then I also wanted to write it because I knew that there were all these programs out there that were still engaging in it. And it's hard to put a pinpoint on like what coercive therapy feels like. And like, you know, yeah, you know, you want to make the adult happy. So you want to do whatever they want you to. And just remembering that, that inconsistency. And I also wanted to point out the hypocrisy of this nation, you know, that this kind of thing can exist. It's so un-American. It's so like bizarre to go to a place where they engage in thought reform. And then, you know, just because it's got Nancy Reagan's thumbs up on it, that must mean brainwashing is okay. So I wanted to draw a parallel to that too.
I've just had the thought while you were saying that as well, that it's so, especially when you think about America over here, we think of patriotism, which is why I'm really looking forward to having a few episodes on ex-military members who are going to talk about their experiences with thought reform and basic training and hazing and all of that, which I think links very closely to some of the stuff we're talking about, and makes me think of cult hopping when you spoke about people who have finished the program and gone straight into the army and thought nothing of it, you know, kind of brings that to mind as well. A sense of normalcy almost after being in the program for so many years and continuing on to something that feels familiar, perhaps when you go into the forces, from things that people have spoken to me about anyway. I've never been in the forces myself or in a troubled teen program, so I can't speak from personal experiences. But what you said there about, you know, a nation of hypocrisy, it's all about free speech, and it's all about, you know, having a sense of freedom. It's the land of the free. America is the land of the free. And then you
autonomy.
Absolutely, autonomy of bodies and voices. And then you're going to send children to these programs where they are completely censored and thrown into a structure that they must be extremely
conform.
They must conform. Otherwise, there's punishment, and there are, you know, things taken away from them. So there is no autonomy in that space whatsoever. So yeah, very interesting that you mentioned hypocrisy, and then America, the land of the free, the land of the free, within these within the subject of therapeutic boarding schools.
Well, and it must be said, you know, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, you put on the anthropological hat for a minute and be like, well, what does society do with people who don't quite conform? And we have, you know, thousands of years of human evolutionary history to look at how that works. And, you know, again, we turn to the Native American thing, like, you would get to be a certain age. There's a rite of passage, just like in Judaism, just like in Christianity, just like in every culture, where there's the time where you stop being a warden of the state, a burden of the tribe or whatever, and you become an individual. And, that wasn't, you didn't have to do it. It was like one of those things where if you weren't ready, then you did it at 16. You didn't have to do it right at 14. It was like, that's how you became part of the community. And in our system, where the troubled teen industry is concerned, you get ripped away from the community that's telling you that you're not conforming well enough. And then you're put into another system where you must conform, but that society doesn't conform to the rest of the society standards. So it's fucking weird, right?
I had never even considered it that way before, but yeah, that is really difficult to wrap your mind around.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the person I mentioned before, Andrew, whose episode is coming out soon, who spoke a lot about reintegration, he actually went to several Scared Straight programs before he attended his wilderness program. So you talked then about thousands of years of history of, if you don't conform, then this is what will happen. And there's so many examples of that. You mentioned Judaism, so you've got the Holocaust is one example you can draw on. There's things like the witch trials. Women are kind of thinking about how they can be independent and how they can be different, and that conformity then leads to being burned alive. Yeah, absolutely. Being burned alive on a stake. So there's hundreds of different examples of this that we can draw on.
You asked me about the illustrator, and I got his permission to speak with you a little bit. So Jonathan was a girl when I knew him at Rocky Mountain Academy.
Okay.
And now he has male pattern baldness and a goatee, which I think is funny. But he was exploited there in a way that you might not consider. And I mentioned this, I think, in the second book, because if you were a really good singer, then, you would go and sing for the parents, when the parents came. And Jonathan was a really good illustrator. Like, he was always able to draw really well. When she was a student at RMA, she was often the one who had to draw, like a poster that would go up over the campus, or she drew the scrolls that we got after these prophetes. And he mentioned to me when I got ready to write the second book that was something that he was really pissed off about, that his art was exploited. Like, they took our skills and exploited them for their own use, so that we didn't even want to use them later, in a way.
And also then almost in a way making you compliant to the manipulation of the parents and the visitors by putting on a front that everything within the program was doing exactly what it said it would do for the residents, when actually, Jonathan probably didn't want to take part in those illustrations whatsoever, but because of the coercion, right, and because of the rules and because of the punishments that came with the rule breaking, didn't really have a choice if he wanted to, retain some sort of comfort.
And more importantly, that CEDU was engaging in rudimentary versions of anti-gay conversion therapy.
We talk a lot on the show about the LGBTQIA plus community. And when you mentioned Jonathan at the start, I didn't know if you were going to talk a little bit about how his experience may have differed from others, because he must have felt extremely oppressed within a program like CEDU, where he probably felt scared to speak truthfully, or if he did speak truthfully, would then be in a very precarious situation because of being honest about that truth.
Right. And it must be said, I mean, nobody left unscathed, but some people were bullied more than others. And I feel like, having to wear really flowery, girly dresses when you're questioning that side of you would be really confusing. And I just remember her experience there quite a bit. So it gave me some semblance of pride, I guess, to be able to ask him to do these illustrations. And he did such an incredible job. And I'm so pleased.
That was definitely going to be one of the questions on the list, was, to talk a little bit about the illustrator, how you approached the illustrator and asked them to be involved in the project. Was it a discussion that did you know of Jonathan's skill set and approach him?
Gosh, I'm trying to remember now. That's such a good question. I think when it came down to putting those interstitial bits in, that the realization that some sort of visual aids would be really nice, because I didn't want to just put like pictures of me as a kid there or something. I didn't want to do that. So thinking about what those illustrations would be, and here's how the conversation went now. I do remember. I asked him to do illustrations, and then a week later, he was like, "So what, do you know what you want?" And I'm like, "No." He's like, I think you're going to do animals." And I'm like, "No, I don't like that." And he goes, "Yes, you do." So it was one of those things where I was just like, okay, well, you've got the text, you can make it work. And sure enough, he really nailed it with these things. So he had a real good vision, and more importantly, he got to tell his story in conjunction with mine, which was cool, because I got a twofer, if you want to call it that, somebody to corroborate my testimony at the same time.
Yeah, I've got the book here in front of me, and I'm just looking at the first animal that appears, and it's a very stylized and unique set of illustrations. So Jonathan definitely has a style. And the front cover, again, it just the contrast of the black and white really sticks out.
He did all that.
Great. It's great. And that's why I wanted to kind of just mention that collaboration, because the artwork really gives another level to the work. The books feel lovely as well, don't they? The books feel like really nice thick pages.
I will tell you, it was probably one of the best moments of my life to hold the first paperback when it came. It was like a magical experience. Like a lot of the time you don't want to see your name or your image or hear your voice or something like that. This was different. It wasn't like a narcissistic, selfish. It was like, I've done something to the very end, and I've done it the best that I can do. And that meant so much to me. I think that's why, and even why I'm agreeing to talk to you, and what I got from the entire experience was such an accomplishment.
And we're kind of weaving in and out of subject matters. We're dipping in and out of the writing and the processes, and talking about the difficulties, but the rewards that come from pushing through those difficulties and arriving on the other side. We're kind of peppering that with things that make us angry about the troubled teen industry, which always seems to happen in these episodes. I'm sure my listeners are like, wow, Casey's really not happy about this one today. I seem to get particularly have a particular set of reactions with these episodes. I don't know if it's because I've done so many now and I still get surprised that things shock me and make me angry after all this time. I mean, you probably still have that to this day with people that you speak with. So I don't know if it's because of that I have strong reactions to this subject matter. We're also talking on the side of that, little small details about things that happen within the CEDU program. And I think that it's kind of a really great way to approach it. It's given us a nice overview of everything, and these are the types of conversations that I really enjoy. You decided to write the book. You were working on it. You had your accident where you injured yourself and thought, right, now I'm really going to sit down and take this seriously. You're doing a little bit every day, so it becomes almost like a ritualistic at that point. You're like, okay, I'm in my routine now. I know what I'm doing. You're sharing small bits on certain forums, so you're putting yourself out there. You're putting your work out there. You're going to a therapist to retrieve some memories. Once you feel like you've got a finished product, how do you find an editor? How does somebody find an editor? And is it a process of finding an editor that works well for you? Or once you've got an editor, do you just take their word because they have experience in that field and they kind of know what they're doing? What does that look like, and how does that work?
Well, this is actually this might be one of the more interesting parts of our interview. When I was first beginning this and people were like, what are you writing about? Oh, what do you do? Oh, right now I'm writing. Oh, what are you writing about? I'd say pig fucking. So it's like, it ends the conversation and then I don't have to say anything else. But in all seriousness though, I would, for people who were really interested, I would say, well, there's 3 books that you could check out if you wanted to understand this. One of them is Snapping, America's Sudden Personality Change or something like that. But it's about the kind of new age post-psychiatric movement that allowed the 60s to have all of these new religious movements. And I would tell them that's one book, and then Cults in Our Midst and Robert J. Lifton's books, so that they could understand I think they're the 9 points of brainwashing. And imagine my surprise when I then realized that there was one book that encompassed all 3 of those, which was Marcus's book, Institutionalized Persuasion. And to find out that he wrote that as an undergrad project just made it all the much more impressive to me. So realizing that there was more about this world that I was writing about than I knew was a really big point, because I did feel really alone out there, and like there wasn't anything like it. And how to then tell the story without exaggerating or just like blaming. That was something that I went back over and read that book so many times, because I didn't want to just say the program is bad. It's bad. It hurts people. I wanted it to be like, well, here's how it was done. And here's what every day felt like. And then you can draw the conclusions on whether that's therapeutic or not.
And that's exactly here, in the preface that you've written, that's exactly what you say. You're very upfront about the intentions of the book and what lies, within its pages, when you say, beyond that, I cannot possibly understand or explain the intentions of a place like CEDU. I can describe a small bit of what it was like to be a kid there, although any description only hints at the helplessness I felt at first. So, you're very open about what people can expect. You can't read the book and be like, oh, that's why CEDU existed, because you've already told us that nobody really knows what the true intentions are or were when the programs were initially set up. But look, I've been highlighting. How does that make you feel to find that your book? I don't know if that makes you feel like uncomfortable or
no.
There's so many bits.
It makes me so proud, because I wrote it to be a tool. I mean, this is the other part, is only people who are readers are going to actually be able to use the tool. And people don't have time for reading books these days. And, so I can only reach the people I could reach. I couldn't do anything else. They created a model by which we needed more of the program in order to feel confident. So, we were dependent on the program. So at the end of it, I think they were kind of creating a therapeutic community where people could come together and take care of their feelings and do all of these things that we had learned over the years. And that they thought that that was going to be like a zeitgeist moment for spirituality, had really big dreams.
It's interesting that you use the word dependence there as well, because going back to that struggle with reintegration into typical society, if the program is no longer there for you to access and you're indoctrinated, I don't know if that's the right word to use. I've been told off for using that word sometimes as well. So, by that point, you're so dependent on the program that when you no longer have access to the program, you can't function in a society that you are not sure how to function in the first place, because it's not the society or community or insular environment that you've been in for the last X amount of years. But also, isn't that the environment that Synanon had to create to maintain its devout followers? And all cult-like environments can only exist when there is that level of dependency, where people can't just say, do you know what, this isn't for me, I'm leaving, whether that's breaking up families and making them live separately so the families can't all leave together, so you'll stay because your child is living with the other children on another part of the commune, or whether it's the sunk cost fallacy of I've been involved in this for 25 years, or, like with what happens with multi-level marketing schemes, where people say, well, I've sunk $20,000 into this, I can't possibly walk away now. Whatever it is that has created that level of dependency, that's exactly what you've just said happens within this program.
So a couple of things here. In writing the books, I also knew that I was exposing a cultic dynamic that existed in these therapeutic environments that we did not sign up for. The parents join the cult, and then we're the ones who actually have to do all of the cult stuff.
Yes.
That's in itself a very interesting place to begin. And secondly, one of the things that I noticed in speaking with people at the International Cultic Studies Association was there would be a time, snapping is just the term that's used, not like snapping like you're suddenly angry or something. It's that something snaps in you and you have a whole perception shift on yourself and your life, or what have you. There's a point in the program that our intellectual capabilities became the weapon of choice. So we all of the skills that we had to intellectually say why we weren't going to integrate into the program became things that made us then integrate into the program. And that's unlike many cults where the inkling of, wait a minute, what, I don't have to live my life like this. I can start to see what it would be like to live without this group. That didn't exist in ours. It only compounded how much more we needed it. The last thought I wanted to tell you was it was my first time publishing a book. So there were times where that inner dialogue is really long, and I may have, 5 years later, I can say there's some things I may have cut out to make some of that internal dialogue a little less thick. But I also want to tell you that it takes 11 or 12 hours to sit down and read the book without any break. Just sit down and read it. That's less than half of one profit.
Whoa, wow. When you put it that way, oh my goodness.
So I did write it for that purpose, that people would be like, oh my God, when is this going to end? And still at the end of them reading the book, be like, you know what? I only put 11 hours into this. This guy was there for 30 months, sleeping there every day. So it's an important thing that I made people go through that, even if they didn't want it.
It kind of does have that feeling. It also has that feeling where things intensifies as you go through.
Yeah.
Like you explained at the beginning, that's how it kind of happens, because it's preparing you for this really long stretch of just overwhelming, really lengthy profits towards the end of your stay in the program. But it's broken up with the different segments that you put into the book. So just when you feel like you can't read anymore because it's exhausted to kind of get through all of these things, it's very clever how you've put things in there that breaks away and gives you a different perspective, and then you're like, okay, I'm refreshed, I'll go back through, and you carry on. And then when you get to the end, you do have that feeling like you have the oversight, but there's still parts missing, because obviously there's book 2 and one day will be book 3, we hope. So it definitely does have that aspect to it, and it's very cleverly done. And the fact that it always like, I read these books and I'm like, wow, and then the author's like, well, yeah, that was the intention, and I'm like, that is so clever. Because in English, when your English teacher would say, what did Shakespeare mean here, and you'd be like, oh, I think he meant this and this, and you're kind of just throwing things out. But then for an author to actually say that's exactly why things were done that way, you're like, wow, that is
right.
It's another level of creativity.
Well, in the first book, I also didn't know I was ever going to write again. So I didn't know there was going to be a second book. I mean, I really thought it was just going to like, okay, I'm self-publishing it. There'll be like maybe 20 or 30 people that look at it, and then it'll die. That'll be like, honestly, that was the conservative and correct way to go into it. Be like, you know what, make it the best I can, so I'm proud of it. And even if nothing happens, at least I've done what I can do. And the thought that, this is just them talking to us. They're not making us do something, except, showing the kind of gray areas here where it's like, the disclosure circles and us walking around. It's still, it's screwy, it's uncomfortable, it's brainwashy, but it's not that bad. I did that on purpose too, because that was our integration into the program. In the second book, I go in a lot more. It becomes much more physical because of how the exercises in these program profits were. And I'm really proud of the second book. I wish I had done a little bit more marketing, because there's a lot of people that read the first book thinking like that's it, but they don't know that there's a whole nother 2 years of the program where they can really get into the details of these raps and profits. And I just haven't had the energy to tell them. I don't know how to get the word out there, and I'm done asking my friends to do that. Like, as a writer too, like everybody I interacted with was like, will you buy my book? Will you review my book? Will you tell your friends about my book? And I got to a certain point where I was like, no fucking more. I can't control this. And I can't let my happiness get tied up in that.
Yeah.
But I do feel like the second book hasn't gotten its due attention.
Well, it may do one day. You never know when that surge of motivation might come back, or when you feel like one day you can get in touch with a network of people who are in a position to be able to help you market things. Social media and things change all the time. I really struggle with social media, so I have absolutely no words of wisdom or advice whatsoever. But this episode is one way that we can get the word out there, so hopefully it will have the desired effect. And things work in this day and age. There's never just one of anything. There's always a sequel. There's always a part 2. There's always a next Friday, there'll be a new episode. Everything works in series now. So it's almost in keeping with the way that Netflix works and Amazon Prime and even YouTube, the way that all of that instant gratification that we spoke about before, the way that it works is that you don't get everything in one go. You get it bit by bit. So the fact that this first book has turned into almost a series is in keeping with the way that we consume media in this day and age.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I don't mean to say, I'm really fortunate because people are getting it. I mean, people do buy it and people do read it. I just mean, like, when the first book came out, I was making social media posts all the time. I was reminding friends, like, please write a review. I can't tell you how important it is. And it was really having an impact on my psyche to have to ask all the time. And whether it's deserved or not doesn't matter. The point is that it was just on us, And,
Yeah.
So, I do feel very fortunate that it's received any, recognition at all. And more importantly, there are a lot of documentarians and filmmakers that are really starting to look at this now. And it's always been a hot subject that people wanted to cover, but I don't think it's been done correctly as of yet.
Yeah,
So I'm
yeah,
really
yeah.
looking forward to see what happens.
I really do hope that there is more media presence as well. I think that would be fantastic. And I just want to reiterate that earlier when I mentioned that we could really benefit from more coverage and documentary footage around this subject, I don't want to detract from anybody's trauma or abuse by saying that certain things shouldn't be focused on. I really want to make a point that that's not what I was trying to say whatsoever. It's extremely important that those things are explored. Just the overall thing, the whole thing needs to be explored from start to finish without focusing too much on just certain parts of it. So I really just wanted to make a point about that, even though people might come back to me and say, well, that's what you do, because I still am shocked by every single program seems to have some type of cavity search of 12-year-olds included in their program, which just absolutely disgusts me every time I hear it. So, people are going to say, well, you focus on that part of every program. So I don't know. I just wanted to make a point of saying that. But one thing I did want to ask you, which is another part that I have highlighted in the book, which again is from the preface that you wrote. This series may interest students of persuasive coercion, undue influence, and tactics used by cults or fringe religious groups to induct new members and retain existing ones. And then that paragraph goes on to talk about breaking down natural mental defense mechanisms and personal autonomy in young people, and talks a lot about coercive control. I wonder, when was it that you started to link CEDU and other programs to cult-like methods of control, programs of undue influence, and kind of tie that as an intrinsic theme to your book, Dead, Insane, or in Jail?
Wow, that's a great question. Wow, that's a really good question. Well, let me say first that I have had opportunities that not every other graduate has had. I had a very good support network from my parents too. So when I went away to college, I had a year and a half of high school that I still had to go to. So I went a year of public school and a year at a private school. And then I was finally on my own. And fortunately, I went to Bard College, which is known for really helping people become independent thinkers. And their motto was a place to think. And I took full advantage of that. For the next 2 years, I studied the rise of totalitarianism and under in the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazism. And I think that clicked something in me. And then in my third year, I had a course that was called cultural reportage. And we had to read an article that was by George Orwell about his boarding school days. And I think that guy who I mentioned earlier, who wrote his book, Such Were the Days, or such, the George Orwell piece is called Such Were the Joys. And he's writing about his time in English boarding schools where, you're hazed and you hate everybody, but at the same time, it gives you your sense of self. And I was reading this at 18 or 19 in college and trying to write an essay about what my experience was at RMA. And so it was 12 years later that I started writing the book, but that's how long it was gestating inside of me, that I knew I'd gone through something that wasn't right. I know I'd gone through something that was totally homophobic. It was kind of like, had weird racial undertones. It was
the smushing is kind of questionable as well, in terms of like the age gap between the adults and the residents as well.
Yes, and in fact, I've had a few conversations with graduates about how it affects the sex life. There's so much interesting psychology to be unturned here, which can create fetishisms and SM. There's a lot of psychological turmoil that went on in those years, and finding a healthy way to deal with it. I'll give you my one example for me. And it actually is very apropos for reasons that I can't mention to you right now. But I became a certified women's crisis counselor and rape counselor in college. And it was really kind of due to my personal experience afterwards, and also being there and hearing about all of these rapes and seeing girls go through their emotions in that way. And it really had a very deep impact on me. So, there are people on the other side of the fence that have learned to exploit people, women in particular, girls. And, and I think that there was one or two that went to RMA. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
There are a few people that have come forward and mentioned some things to me in writing. One person remained anonymous and did mention something that happened at Rocky Mountain Academy that included sexual assault. But again, that has been a conversation on that not wanting to become the main focus of the subject matter when we've discussed RMA on the show. So it has been hinted towards. Some people that have listened to the coverage might be able to work out which person in question I'm talking about, but she asked that not be the sole focus of the episode, which I can appreciate, because she didn't want to detract from other people's experiences, which is very difficult in this program. And it's, as you mentioned before, there are no words, so it's difficult to formulate the correct response as a host as well, hearing those stories that are extremely difficult to listen to, but also for the guest to relive. So it's alluded to, but it's not outright spoken about.
There was like 8 or 9 years where I knew one of my friends had been molested by a staff member. And then I had other friends of mine when I was writing the books who would, without knowing this allegation, would say like, this particular staff was a good staff. And how hard it was for me to be in the middle and be like, no, he fucking wasn't. He wasn't a good staff. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you still have Stockholm Syndrome is really on you. But not being able to say what I knew. And so that has been another piece of this as an advocate, which is to know that there's all of these deep psychological rooted issues that create the bonds between the counselors that we had there. So much so that I felt weird about publishing the book, and I felt like I was like dragging out parents' secrets or something like that. But at the end of the day, I changed everybody's name and I decided that this had to be done. And so it's been very validating to have some of those students come back to me and go, oh my God, I didn't know. And now that I know those things, it really brings home the fact that there wasn't really any good staff there, is kind of what it comes down to.
It's hard as well, because we could be talking about different people and different staff members and different residents. I know that there was a lot of things that happened between residents themselves, and then other things that happened between staff and residents. So we could be talking about completely different people, because as you mentioned, there's a lot that went on that's public knowledge. There's a lot that went on, I'm sure, that's discussed between the spaces like the Troubled Teens forum on the Troubled Teens subreddit, and then there's probably hundreds of things that happened that will never be common knowledge to people
that's right,
like myself. So it's very difficult to think about those things, and difficult to remain partial or even close-lipped about things that are not our experiences to share, even though we know that person may now be working in other education facilities or other programs such as the one that we're talking about today. So it's a very, very tough one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You just mentioned another important point, though. I've had people reach out to me who were in the early versions of CEDU too. So I've had people who were there in the 70s as kids reach out to me. So I have been privy to see a culture of abuse lasting decades that other people only see in their small window of when they were there. And that has been really impactful for me.
A few people have also mentioned that experiences that they've shared in these raps and profits, or whatever the chosen name is for the program that they are in, there's the same process, it's just renamed,
right,
in a lot of these programs, because they use the synonym skeleton and just apply it to their program. So it seems anyway. They will admit to something that happened to them, deeply traumatizing, and a lot of the time are victim blamed and told that these things that have happened are their fault, whether it's taking drugs or trying alcohol or being involved in a sexual relationship or an abusive environment. And a lot of the time when this victim blaming happens, it then means that these people might feel like they need to take that trauma with them, never mention it to anybody, and keep it to themselves in fear of having that same reaction to that omission. So maybe, there's a lot of people carrying things that we'll never know about, who feel like they can't talk about those things because it's their fault that it happened, or they're worried about the reaction that they'll get from the people that they tell. So that is one, and it shouldn't be a small thing, but it's one very small fragment in this overall troublesome industry.
You have unresolved issues compounded by unresolved issues. It was that it really does mess with the attachment part of the brain. If you just look at it on a physiological level, to be snatched out of that environment of stasis with your parents and put into another one is in itself very disruptive. And then years later, you go through a very similar experience when you leave the collective, and now you're all scrambled up again.
Absolutely. And not only that, you're not being, going from your parents' house to your aunt's house a couple of hours away, who you visit for Christmas every year. You're being transported to an environment typically in the middle of nowhere, with people you don't know, people you've never met, in a routine that you have never experienced. So all of these things are new. This transitional period is so much upheaval that even that in itself can come with very serious PTSD, very serious trust issues and attachment issues, and all of those things. Again, I always like to reiterate that I don't like to couch diagnose, because I don't have any professional experience. I'm just going by courses that I've been on and things that I've read, but I can imagine that,
clearly that would have a traumatizing effect on the brain.
Just going from your typical everyday environment to something completely unknown, surrounded by unfamiliar people, must be very
peer
scary.
Policing, it's some of the hallmarks of how you can gauge if there is something afoul, and that is, kids policing other kids, kids ratting on each other, and they're the ones that run the program, really. And they're also the ones that dish out the punishments. We can't have Lord of the Flies, and that's, we had a lot of that activity there.
Yep, self-policing.
And the big bullies won. No, the biggest, the person who was the loudest and talked over the person the most was the more enlightened.
Self-policing is a whole thing, isn't it? A whole tactic on its own. I could just have hours of discussion about how, if you're more worried about each other, you're not questioning the intentions of those in positions of power, like the staff members and those in those basically responsible for your entire well-being. If you're more worried about what you say to somebody in your peer group, you don't have any space in your mind to question why somebody might need to perform a strip search on you, or why you're only being allowed to have X amount of hours sleep a night, or why you need to dig a hole and lie in it and pretend that you're or be threatened with being buried alive, so you talked about being self-published. How does somebody go about becoming self-published, that process? What what does that look like? If somebody's got a piece of work in mind, if somebody's completed a piece of work, how would they then go through the motions of getting it out there to the wider public?
Okay, well, it's pretty easy now because Kindle makes it, so you can just simply go on Amazon and publish it. But I'm telling you, and all of your listeners, if you are the only one looking at it, it isn't done. That's just for starters. Anybody can publish something now, but I think it's worth it to outsource editing. How do you go about that? I think you audition that. For me, like I said, Anne actually taking the time to read the books that I told her to, if she wanted to understand the bigger world of CEDU before she read my books, and she did that. To me, that was this is somebody who's willing to invest hours into my writing, and I'm going to pay them. So that's the other thing, is it can't be free. This has to be a business relationship that you might have. Now, if you're one of those people who has already gone through the editing process and you think it's as good as it can be, then you could try reaching out to independent publishers, but they're going to want you to jump through the hoops, only send them 2 pages. And, I didn't want to do all that. I knew that I had something that was pretty close to as good as I could get it. And I didn't want somebody to come back and tell me, can we change this or that? And, so once the decisions were made, then the next process could happen. And it's kind of easy in a way to just get the ISBN number, the Library of Congress registered, and then upload it, and then you're done. But that's really just the basics. If you want people to know about it, then you need to have a little campaign first and make a newsletter and have subscribers, or at least a good social media following. I'm not trying to put dirt in anybody's dream. I'm just saying it's a really tough business out there, and there's a lot of really great writers, great musicians, and so it's the same as everything else.
Yep. Absolutely everything that you've just said can be applied to podcasting. Absolutely all of it. I remember reading a post on the r/podcasting subreddit that said something like, if 90% of my podcast is me doing social media posts and trying to raise awareness of my podcast, then I don't want to be a podcaster. So
right.
That is, that's the difficulty. I've recently done a monthly memoir giveaway with Ronit Plank, who released a book called When She Comes Back, about her mother going to join Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and his movement over in India and then over in Oregon. So she is such a busy lady. I don't know how she does it all. I have such a high amount of respect for Ronit and the amount of work that she does. She's always on a different podcast every day. She has her own podcast. She's reading other people's books. She's promoting her book. She's going on tours around the country and talking at different conferences and talking at different bookstores and doing all of these things. And I just think, wow, that is so much work. And when you talk about an awareness campaign, that I feel like that's what it looks like, but it's a heck ton of work from what I can see on Ronit's Instagram page. It's a different guest appearance on a podcast every day. It's a lot, but she always has a smile on her face, so I hope she enjoys it.
All right. Well, I think we've touched on, we've really just scratched the surface, but I think, like, if you were to cover an episode that had to do with the Stockholm Syndrome just by itself, like what happens and why we like fawn, flight, whatever, like when I really think about how I would try to impress these people who I fucking hated, and it makes me ill when I think back on it. But of course I was having a totally natural brain reaction to something scary, something that I couldn't control. So I think you've got something there, and also the like what's it like to integrate back into the world afterwards, and what helps and what doesn't. That crosses like a bunch of different programs. So if you ever want to have me back on to touch just on those, I'm game. All right.
I would absolutely love that. Yes, I really enjoyed our conversation. I feel like because when I spoke to Bob, he said, Zach might not want to speak about his CEDU experience, like because I go through Stephen Hassan's bite model, which is like, did you have any food restrictions? Were you sleep deprived? So it's very like step-by-step methods of coercion and control. And Bob was kind of like, well, that's what his book tells you. The book tells you all of that stuff. So, why don't you talk more about the book process? And I was like, yeah, that's great. That's another, cool. That's another insightful piece of media that I haven't had the opportunity to do yet. So, good. I would absolutely love the opportunity to talk more about everything. And if there was a slogan for this show, it would honestly be, we've just scratched the surface. I feel like I say that every episode, and you've just said that. So that had me like internally, I was like, yes.
That's a great one. You lead with that.
When I mentioned before whether residence is the right word to use, and you said detainees is a good word, we touched on how some people may get upset or offended or argue that we are painting these programs in a negative light when that's not necessarily fair, because the programs were positively effective for those people. I always encourage those people to get in touch with me. I really do appreciate hearing things from the other perspective. This is not a platform to do that. So I'm trying to let people have a voice about their traumatic experiences, their experiences of coercive control, their experiences of high demand religious groups. That is what this space is purposefully for. Just because of just because that's the case, that doesn't mean I don't want to hear from people that do want to express the other side of their story. And I always like to say that, when we talk about different congregations and religious movements and Christian sects, that just because one particular church building has problematic people in positions of power, that doesn't necessarily mean that entire religious movement is problematic in itself, although a lot of the time I would argue that it is. However, I still want people to come forward and tell me that the other side. So I just wanted to throw that out there for anyone that's listening that would like to come and email me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com and tell me their story, because I just love to learn, and the more information that I have, the better informed I am to have these discussions that are going out on a public forum. And I feel like that's my responsibility as a podcast host to kind of make sure that that's happening. So get in touch. But I did want to let people know where they can find your books, where they can find your work. And also, I understand that you do have a Patreon with various tiers, and some of it includes some of Jonathan's illustrations, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, that's right. Yes. You could have the original for just a little bit of financial assistance. You can find me at Patreon /Zack DIJ, like Zach Dead Insane or in jail. You can also go to deadinsaneorinjail.com and either sign up for the newsletter or just drop me a line. And of course, you can find the books at Amazon, or if you want, just reach out to me and I'd love to send a few.
That's fantastic. It's very exciting that I've been able to sit down and have this conversation with you today. And because we haven't focused on or we haven't focused too much on your personal story, we've focused a lot on the political side, it's given me a platform to get some of my anger out. So I really appreciate that as well. And I am looking forward to going out to get the second book, to read that. Perhaps when I do the monthly giveaway in January, which will now be running as we speak, I can include part 1 and part 2 of the book, if that is something that people would like. And also, I do feature Zach's book on one of my Patreon tiers. So if you subscribe to my Patreon, I think it's the top tier, so it's like $20 a month. you will receive a copy of Zack's book that I will post to you. And then also 10% of every $100 that you pledge through Patreon, or 10% of your lifetime pledge, will go to Breaking Code Silence, which is the non-profit organization that is helping to make waves as we talk about kind of reform around the troubled teen industry. So it's benefiting my podcast, it's benefiting Zack with getting his work out there, and it's also benefiting Breaking Code Silence. So if anybody would be interested in signing up, you can do that. If not, you can enter into the monthly memoir giveaway at Cult Vault Pod. All you have to do is like, follow, and comment on any of my social media posts across January for a chance to win one of 3 copies of Zack Bonnie's memoir, Dead, Insane, or in Jail. So thank you so much for joining me today, Zack. I'm definitely going to be in touch to hit you up for a second interview.
Okay.
Where we can go through and talk about some more, what's the right word, narrowed, some more specific things around the industry and difficulties in certain areas and how we can navigate those difficulties, and perhaps the best tools for people to overcome any of those experiences that they've had. So I really, really appreciate your time. Anybody that wants to go and read Zack's work, Dead, Insane, or in Jail, a CEDU memoir by Zack Bonnie, I highly recommend it. One of the first memoirs that I read around coercion and cultic control. It's full of passages of things that I've thought were important to remember. So definitely go and grab yourself a copy if you haven't. And we will speak to you soon, Zack. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You have a good one. Nice talking to you, JC.
Bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.